Clara Whitmore pressed her father's pocket watch against her chest and screamed, not from grief, not yet, but from the rage of a woman who had just watched three men in black coats nail a foreclosure notice to her father's front door while his body was still warm inside. She ripped that notice down with her bare hands. If you've ever had something taken from you before you even had the chance to fight for it, stay with me. Subscribe, drop your city in the comments, and let's see how far this story travels. The morning Samuel Whitmore died, the summer heat came down on Caldwell Creek, Montana, like God himself had turned away and left the town to cook. Clara had ridden through the night. 40 miles of hard, dark prairie between her and the boarding house in Miles City, where she'd spent the last 14 months trying to convince herself she didn't need to come home. She'd taken work at a dry goods ledger. Nothing glamorous, nothing permanent, just enough arithmetic in her fingers to keep her from thinking about the ranch and the man she'd left running it alone. She'd gotten the telegram at 7:30 in the morning. 3 words: come home, urgent. Her father never sent telegrams. Samuel Whitmore wrote letters, long ones full of his cramped handwriting and his complaints about the summer grass and the creek running low. A telegram from Samuel meant there was no time left for words. She'd known before she saddled up. She'd known the way you know a storm is coming before the sky changes color, something in your chest just drops, and you ride. She arrived at the ranch at first light to find Doc Heller standing on the porch, hat in his hands, and she didn't even have to ask. He went peaceful, Doc Heller said, in his sleep. Heart gave out sometime after midnight. Clara didn't cry. Not yet. She walked past the doctor, pushed open the front door, and went to her father's room, and stood there looking at the man who had raised her alone for 22 years, who had taught her to ride before she could read, who had calluses on his hands like bark on a cottonwood tree. She stood there for a long time, long enough for the sun to fully clear the hills and pour through the window and fall across his face. Then she heard boots on the porch. Not one set. 3. She came back out to the main room and opened the front door, and that's when she saw them. 3 men in black coats, the kind that didn't belong to ranchers or working men. The kind that belonged to lawyers and land agents. The one in the center was holding a folded document, and before Clara could open her mouth, he was already moving toward the doorpost. The sound of the nail going in stopped her cold. What in God's name do you think you're doing? The man in the center, square-jawed, pale eyes. No apology anywhere on his face, turned to her and touched the brim of his hat. The gesture was deliberate, polite in the way that powerful men are polite when they already know they've won. Miss Whitmore, my name is Gerald Pratt. I represent the First Territorial Bank of Helena. I'm deeply sorry for your loss. He paused just long enough for the words to sound practiced. Your father carried a significant debt against this property. With his passing, that debt is immediately due. The bank has authorized me to begin foreclosure proceedings. Clara looked at the notice on the door. She looked at Pratt. She looked at the 2 men standing behind him like they were furniture. Then she reached out and tore the notice off the doorpost with one clean pull. Get off my land. Pratt didn't flinch. He reached into his coat and produced a second copy folded neatly and held it out to her. The notice is a formality, Miss Whitmore. The legal process has already begun. You have 30 days. I said get off my land. 30 days, he repeated. Then he put his hat back on, nodded once, and the 3 of them walked back down to their horses, like they hadn't just hammered a coffin shut over everything she had ever known. Clara stood on that porch until they were out of sight. Then she looked down at the paper in her hands. The numbers didn't make sense at first. The debt was too large, the interest accrued too fast, the timeline all wrong. Her father had taken the loan 6 years ago. He'd never mentioned it. Not once in a letter. Not once when she'd visited. She went back inside and sat down at his desk and started going through his papers, and the picture that assembled itself over the next 2 hours was one she did not recognize. Samuel Whitmore had been borrowing against the ranch for years, quietly, steadily, like a man bailing water out of a boat with a tin cup, never telling anyone the hull had a hole. He owed $1,100 to a bank that was not going to wait. Clara sat back in their chair and pressed her hands flat on the desk to keep them from shaking. She was still sitting like that when she heard a horse come into the yard. She didn't look up right away. She heard the rider dismount, heard the particular weight of a man's boots on the porch, heard a knock on the open door. "Clara!" She knew the voice. She'd known it since she was 8 years old. She still didn't look up. "I heard about your father," Ethan Cole said. "I'm sorry." Ethan Cole was the son of the neighboring ranch family, the Coles who ran their land along the East Ridge and had been Whitmore neighbors for 2 decades. He and Clara had grown up on opposite sides of the same fence line. Literally. They'd argued over that fence line more times than either of them could count, about water rights, about cattle, drifting about a dozen small grievances that had a way of standing in for larger, harder conversations neither of them ever quite managed to have. He was 35 now, brown-haired, weathered the way men who worked outdoors get weathered, not worn down, just sharpened. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, and he looked at her the way she'd always hated, like he could see exactly what was wrong and was trying to decide whether to say it. "I don't need company, Ethan." "I know." He came inside anyway. "What's that in your hands?" She set the paper down. He crossed the room, picked it up, read it. The muscles in his jaw tightened. 1100, he said, "from the First Territorial Bank." "Gerald Pratt was here." It wasn't a question. "He nailed the notice to the door while my father's body was still in that room." Her voice came out flat and hard, the way it did when she was holding something back that she didn't intend to let out. Ethan set the paper down carefully. "Your father ever tell you about this?" "No, not once. Not once." She finally looked up at him. "Did he tell you?" Something moved across Ethan's face. Brief. Almost nothing. But she caught it. "Ethan." "He mentioned the ranch was tight," he said. "Last fall. I offered to help. He told me he had it handled." "And you believed him?" "I believed him," Ethan said. Samuel Whitmore was not a man who admitted when he was drowning. That landed somewhere under her ribs because it was true. Her father had been the most self-sufficient, proudest, most infuriatingly private man she had ever known, and she had loved him completely. And she had still left. She had still packed her trunk and ridden out to Miles City because she needed to prove something to herself that she couldn't have named out loud, and now he was dead, and the ranch was being taken, and she hadn't been here. "Don't," Ethan said. She looked at him. "Whatever you're about to tell yourself," he said, "don't." "You don't know what I'm thinking." "I know exactly what you're thinking. You're thinking this is your fault for leaving. It's not." He picked up his hat off the table. "It was already like this when you left Clara. Your being here wouldn't have changed the debt. It only would have meant you watched it happen slower." "That's not comfort, Ethan." "No," he agreed. "It's not. It's just true." He moved toward the door. "I'll come back this afternoon. There's feed left in the coal barn. I'll bring enough to last the horses through the week." "I don't need your charity." He stopped, turned back slowly. There was something in his expression that wasn't quite patience and wasn't quite frustration, something in between, like a man who had practiced a long time at choosing his words carefully. "It's not charity," he said. "It's what neighbors do." "We're not—" She stopped herself. "We're not what?" he said very quietly. The silence between them had edges. It always had. Even when they were children arguing over the fence line, there had been something underneath the arguing that neither of them ever named, and they were both old enough now to know what it was, and both stubborn enough to keep not naming it. "I'll pay you back," she said. "Suit yourself." He put his hat on. "I'm sorry about Samuel. He was a good man." He left. Clara sat in the quiet of the house for a long moment. Then she picked up the bank's notice again and read through it a second time, more slowly, looking for something she might have missed. Some clause, some error, some argument she could make. There wasn't one. $1,100, 30 days. She stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the yard, the stable, the water trough, the fence. Her father had rebuilt twice in 20 years. The hay barn with the patched roof, the pasture running out toward the ridge in colors of July gold. She was 25 years old. She had $42 in her travel purse, a horse that needed new shoes, and a ranch that a bank in Helena was going to take apart board by board unless she stopped them. She pressed her hand against the window glass warm from the morning sun. "All right," she said quietly to no one. To herself. To her father, maybe. "All right. You want a fight? I'll give you a fight." That afternoon, Clara rode into Caldwell Creek for the first time in 14 months. The town hadn't changed much. A few new storefronts, a second saloon on the far end of Main Street, the same dust hanging in the same air over the same wooden boardwalk. People looked up when she rode through the way small-town people always look at someone who left and came back with that particular mixture of curiosity and judgment that doesn't require any words. She hitched her horse in front of the assayer's office and walked into the telegraph station first. She sent a message to the First Territorial Bank in Helena, requesting a copy of the original loan documents and the full payment schedule. If she was going to fight this, she needed to understand exactly what her father had signed. She was coming back out when she nearly walked straight into Mayor Aldous Carey. He was a wide man, Carey wide in the shoulders, wide in the middle, with a large mustache that he clearly considered distinguished. He'd been mayor of Caldwell Creek for 11 years, and he carried that tenure around with him like a suitcase full of other people's money. "Miss Whitmore," he said with a smile that didn't reach the top half of his face. "Back home. I heard about your father, a sad business." "Thank you, Mayor. Are you planning to stay or just passing through to settle the estate?" The question was careful, deliberate. "I'm planning to stay," Clara said. The smile thinned. "Of course. Though I understand the situation with the bank is complicated. If there's anything the town can do—" "There isn't," she said pleasantly. "But thank you." She walked past him and kept going. The assayer's office held the land records, and Clara spent an hour there with a thin, spectacled man named Hollis, who pulled out the county survey maps with the weary efficiency of someone who has watched a lot of families lose their land and has run out of things to say about it. She was bent over the survey table, tracing the boundary lines of the Whitmore property with her finger, when the door opened behind her, and she heard Hollis straighten up the way clerks do when someone important walks in. "Mr. Pruitt," Hollis said. "Just need a moment with the lady," said a voice she didn't recognize. She turned. He was perhaps 40, with a dark vest and expensive boots, and the particular ease of a man who is accustomed to getting what he wants before he even asks for it. He had a wide, practiced smile and pale blue eyes that were doing a very thorough job of assessing her without appearing to. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Jackson Pruitt. I own the Pruitt Cattle Company up on the North Range." She knew the name. She hadn't known him personally. He'd come to Caldwell Creek after she'd left. But she'd heard the name in letters, and the Hollis's expression right now was telling her things the letters hadn't. "Mr. Pruitt," she said evenly. "I wanted to offer my condolences personally," he said, stepping closer to the survey table. "Samuel was well. He was a proud man. Stubborn, if you'll forgive me. He refused every offer I ever made him." He glanced down at the map, at the Whitmore property lines. "I've made 4 offers on that land in 3 years, Miss Whitmore. Your father declined every one. He tended to keep what was his." "Yes," Pruitt smiled. "But the situation has changed, hasn't it? I want you to know that my offer stands. Whatever the bank is asking, I'll beat it. You walk away clean, no debt money in your pocket, and you can go back to—" He paused, looked at her with polite curiosity. "Where was it, Miles City?" "Yes," she said. "You can go back to Miles City with enough to start over properly." He spread his hands. "No need to struggle through what's coming." "What's coming?" she repeated. 30 days is not a long time," he said gently, reasonably, in the tone of a man explaining something unpleasant for your own good. "And the Whitmore land in its current condition is going to be very difficult to—" "Mr. Pruitt," she said, "my father is not buried yet, and you're standing in a county office asking me to sell." He held her gaze. "I'm trying to help. You're trying to buy." She rolled the survey map closed. "The land is not for sale. It was not for sale when my father was alive, and it is not for sale now. You can show yourself out." The smile didn't leave his face. It just changed quality, the way a flame changes when the wind hits it. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "the bank is going to foreclose. You know that, don't you? 30 days isn't enough time. You don't have the money, and you don't know anyone in this county who does." He stepped back, picked up his hat from the counter. "When you've had time to think it through, and you will, I'm not a hard man to find." He left. Clara stood at the survey table with both hands pressed flat against the wood and her jaw tight and her breathing careful. Hollis was studying the far wall with intense interest. "How long has Pruitt been trying to buy land in this county?" she asked. "About 3 years," Hollis said, still addressing the wall. "How many properties has he acquired?" Hollis was quiet for a moment. 7. "How many of those went through foreclosure first?" He turned and looked at her then. His expression was the expression of a man who has answered this question in his own head many times and has never once liked the answer. 5, he said. Clara picked up her hat. "Thank you, Hollis." She walked out into the summer heat and stood on the boardwalk and let the sun hit her full in the face. 7 properties, 5 foreclosures. Gerald Pratt of the First Territorial Bank and Jackson Pruitt of the Pruitt Cattle Company and Mayor Aldous Carey with his careful questions and his thin smile. She didn't know yet exactly how it was connected, but she knew it was. Her father had refused 4 offers. Her father had taken on a bank loan that didn't make arithmetic sense, and now 3 men in black coats had nailed a foreclosure notice to her door before the body was cold. She walked back to her horse, untied the reins, and looked east toward the ridge where the Cole Ranch sat in its summer dust. Ethan Cole had known her father's finances were bad. Ethan Cole's land ran directly along the eastern boundary of the Whitmore property. She stood with the reins in her hands and made herself think it clearly, because she was not a woman who flinched from hard thoughts even when they hurt. Then she pushed it aside, not because she trusted him, but because she wasn't going to decide anything today based on suspicion. She was going to decide based on facts, and right now she needed more facts. She mounted up and turned her horse toward home. The summer sun rode high and brutal above Caldwell Creek, and Clara Whitmore rode beneath it with the straight back of a woman who has just declared a war she does not yet know how to win. But she was going to win it. That much she already knew. The morning after her father's burial, Clara was up before sunrise. She hadn't slept. She'd sat at Samuel's desk through most of the night going through every paper she could find. Ledger books, old receipts, land survey copies, letters from the bank going back 4 years. By the time the sky started to lighten, she had 2 things: a headache that started behind her eyes and spread down her neck, and a growing certainty that something about the loan was wrong. Not wrong in the way that mistakes are wrong. Wrong in the way that lies are wrong. The original loan document had arrived by telegraph courier that morning. The bank had responded faster than she'd expected, which told her something in itself. She spread it on the desk and read it 3 times. The interest rate was legal. The repayment schedule was legal. Every line of it was perfectly, carefully, suffocatingly legal. But the date on the first loan installment didn't match the date on the corresponding entry in her father's ledger. It was off by 11 days. 11 days in which, according to the bank's own record, a partial payment had been made. A payment that did not appear anywhere in Samuel Whitmore's careful, meticulous handwriting. Clara set the papers down and pressed her fingers to her mouth. Her father had recorded every cent that passed through this ranch. Every bag of flour, every horseshoe nail, every dollar paid to a seasonal hand. Samuel Whitmore did not lose track of 11 days and a partial loan payment. Someone had altered the record. She was still sitting with that thought when she heard a horse come hard into the yard. Not the careful walk of a neighbor paying a morning visit, but a fast, urgent canter that stopped too suddenly. She was at the door before the knock landed. It was young Pete Aldridge, 16 years old, who ran odd jobs for half the ranches in the county. He was breathing hard, and his hat was in his hands, and he had the look of a boy who had been told to deliver a message and wasn't sure he wanted to. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I got sent to tell you somebody let your cattle out last night. The north fence is down. Your herd scattered up toward the ridge." She stared at him. "All of them. Most. Mr. Cole's already up there. He started gathering them before sunup. Asked me to come tell you." She had her boots on, and her horse saddled in under 4 minutes. The ride up to the north pasture took 20 minutes at a hard pace, and the whole way she was doing arithmetic in her head. How many head, how much time? Whether the cattle would drift toward the Cole land, or further east toward the Pruitt Range. What it would mean if any of them were lost or claimed before she could get there. She found Ethan at the gap in the fence line. He had 3 of her hands with him, men who had worked the Whitmore ranch for years, and who had apparently come on their own when they'd seen the cattle loose at dawn. Ethan himself was on horseback working a group of about 30 head back toward the gap, moving with the particular efficiency of a man who has done this so many times it has become instinct. He saw her coming and turned his horse toward her. "How bad?" she called. 60, maybe 70 head got through. We've got 40 back. The rest are scattered north and east." He pulled up beside her. "The fence didn't fall, Clara. It was cut." She looked at the downed section. 3 posts pulled clean wire cut in 2 places with something sharp. This wasn't wind damage or a weak post giving way. This was deliberate. "Last night?" she said. "Had to be. I checked this fence 2 days ago." She looked at him. "You checked my fence." "I check all the fence lines after a dry spell," he said, meeting her eyes without apology. "Wood gets brittle. It's practical, not sentimental." She let that go for now. "I need to know if any of them drifted onto Pruitt land." Something shifted in Ethan's expression. "Why Pruitt land specifically?" "Because if Pruitt's men find Whitmore cattle on Pruitt Range, those cattle don't come back. Not in 30 days. Not ever." She turned her horse. "Which direction east?" "Clara." "Which direction?" He came after her. They rode east together, pushing hard, and he told her what he knew about Pruitt's operation as they rode the way the Pruitt Cattle Company had expanded in the last 3 years, buying up land, absorbing smaller ranches, always legal, always quiet, always preceded by some piece of misfortune that made the selling family feel like they had no other choice. "You knew all this," she said, not looking at him. "I suspected, and you didn't say anything to my father." "I told your father I thought Pruitt was trouble. Samuel told me to mind my own business and worry about my own land." A beat. "He wasn't wrong, technically." "He was dying and didn't know it," Clara said. "A little less technically would have been appreciated." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "I know." They found 11 head on the eastern edge of the Whitmore Range, dangerously close to the boundary line, but still on the right side of it. Clara counted every one of them twice before she let herself breathe. They spent the better part of the morning getting the cattle back, the 4 ranch hands working in practiced silence while Clara and Ethan rode the perimeter, and Ethan repaired the fence section with wire and posts he'd apparently brought along without being asked. She noticed that. She didn't comment on it. By midday, they had 63 head accounted for. 7 were still missing. They could have gone north. One of the hands said an older man named Roy, who'd worked the Whitmore Ranch for 9 years and had the kind of permanent squint that came from spending a lifetime looking into the sun. "There's a water source up past the tree line. If they were spooked and running, that's where they'd go." "Can you find them?" Clara asked. "Me and Denny can try," Roy said. "Might take till evening." "Go," she said. They went. The other 2 hands went back to the ranch to start repairing the stable gate that had apparently also been damaged overnight, something Clara hadn't even known about until one of them mentioned it while they were loading up to leave. She stood with Ethan in the pasture. The summer heat was full up now, no mercy in it. "2 separate points of damage in one night," she said. "The fence and the gate." "Someone wanted you busy," Ethan said. "Wanted you running around putting out fires instead of sitting at that desk going through papers." She looked at him sharply. "How do you know I was going through papers?" "Because you're you," he said simply. Your father dies, a bank shows up the same morning, and you find a discrepancy. And I know there's a discrepancy because your father told me last spring that he was worried about the loan records. He said something was off, and he couldn't prove it. He held her gaze. He asked me to look into it. I was still looking when he died. The ground shifted under her, not physically, but in every other way. He asked you, she said. Yes, my father. Who told you to mind your own business? He changed his mind, Ethan said. By spring he was scared, Clara. Not the kind of scared a man shows on his face, the other kind, the quiet kind. He paused. He was scared for the ranch, and he was scared for you. She turned away from him and walked a few steps and stood with her back to him because she needed a moment where he couldn't see her face. Her father scared. Her father who had faced a drought in '73 that nearly wiped out half the county and had kept working through it with the same blunt determination he applied to everything. That man scared. And he hadn't told her. He'd told Ethan. She turned back. What did you find? Enough to know the discrepancy is real. Not enough to prove it in a court or to a bank officer. He reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper. I found a receipt from the Miles City Freight Office for a payment transfer dated the same day as that missing installment. A transfer that wasn't made in your father's name. She took the paper. Read it. The transfer was listed under the name of a holding company, 2 words she didn't recognize in the amount that exactly matched the disputed payment. Someone made a payment in his name, she said slowly, and then what claimed it wasn't made altered the bank's record, or arranged for the bank's record to show something different than what actually happened. If someone at the bank was willing to adjust a number, Pratt, she said. I don't know that for certain. But you think it. He was quiet for a beat. I think there are 3 men in this county with something to gain from the Whitmore land going to foreclosure. Pratt gets his bank fee, Carey gets the political goodwill of a major property transfer, and Pruitt gets the land itself. He took the paper back from her, folded it, held it carefully. I think your father figured out enough of it to be dangerous, and I think he died before he could act on it. Clara looked at him for a long moment. The sun was directly overhead. A hawk moved somewhere above them, slow and patient in wide circles. You've been carrying this since spring, she said. Yes. Alone. Samuel asked me not to say anything until he was ready to move. He's dead, Ethan. I know, he said. Which is why I'm telling you now. She took that in, held it, turned it over. Then she said, I need to see everything you have. Every piece of paper, every record, every note you've made. I figured you'd say that. He almost smiled. Not quite. Can you be at the coal barn at sundown? Yes. He nodded and reached for his horse's reins, and she said, Ethan. He stopped. Why did he ask you and not me? The question came out quieter than she intended, more honest than she intended. Ethan turned back, and his expression was the most unguarded she'd seen it in years, maybe ever. Because you left, he said. Not unkindly, just plainly. And he didn't want to be the reason you came back before you were ready. She didn't have an answer for that. She wasn't sure there was one. He rode back toward the coal land, and she stood there in the summer heat and thought about a man who had been scared and drowning and had still somehow been more concerned with protecting his daughter's freedom than with calling her home to help him. Samuel Whitmore, the most infuriating man who had ever lived. She loved him so completely that the grief of it hit her then for the first time, full and hard, right there in the open pasture under the Montana summer sky with nobody watching. She let it come. She stood and let it move through her, all of it, the anger and the sorrow and the guilt and the love. She gave it about 2 minutes. Then she straightened her back, set her jaw, mounted her horse, and rode back to the ranch to make a list of everything she was going to do next. She was her father's daughter. That meant grieving didn't stop the work. It just happened at the same time. The list, by the time she'd written it out at the kitchen table, had 11 items. 4 of them required money she didn't have. 3 required information she hadn't been able to get yet. 2 required people she wasn't sure she could trust. And the last 2 required something that couldn't be listed, the kind of nerve that doesn't show up in writing only in the moment when you need it. She was reading it over when somebody knocked at her door. She opened it to find Margaret Hale, who ran the millinery shop on Main Street and who had been her mother's closest friend before her mother passed. Margaret was 60, sharp-eyed, and had the backbone of a woman who'd built something from nothing and intended to keep it. She was carrying a covered dish. "I'm not here to fuss," Margaret said before Clara could say a word. "I brought food because you haven't eaten, and I know it, and I'm leaving the moment you tell me to. But before I go, I need to tell you something." Clara stepped back and let her in. Margaret set the dish on the table, looked at the papers spread across it, and didn't comment on them. She sat down across from Clara and folded her hands and said, "Aldous Carey came into the shop this morning. He asked me if I thought you'd sell." Clara went very still. "He asked it casually," Margaret said. "The way he asks everything, like it doesn't matter, like it's just conversation. But Aldous Carey never says anything that's just conversation." She met Clara's eyes. "He's working with Pruitt. I don't have proof. But I've watched that man operate for 11 years, and when he starts asking casual questions about a property, that property changes hands inside of 60 days. Every time. 5 times in 3 years," Clara said. "That's what Hollis told me." Margaret nodded slowly. "Your father was the one they couldn't get. Samuel refused every offer, every pressure, every piece of grief they sent his way. And they sent some." She paused. "Did you know about the water?" "What water?" "2 summers ago, the creek that runs through the north end of your property, somebody dumped something in it, upstream. Killed the grass along the bank, made the water unfit for the cattle for most of the season. Your father had to truck water in. Cost him money he didn't have." She held Clara's gaze. "He couldn't prove it was deliberate. But there's not a rancher in this county who believed it was an accident." Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach despite the summer heat. "They've been pushing him for 2 years. "At least," Margaret said. "Maybe longer. And nobody—" She stopped herself. Started again. "Nobody in this town said anything." Margaret was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was careful and tired and honest. "This is a small town, Clara. Pruitt buys from the local suppliers. Carey controls the town council. The bank holds mortgages on half the businesses on Main Street." She spread her hands. "People have their own to protect." "So they watched." "People watched," Margaret said. "And I'm ashamed of that. And I'm sitting here now, which is about 4 months too late, but it's what I've got." She stood up, smoothed her skirt. "I'm telling you because you need to know what you're walking into. And because your mother would have told you herself if she were here, and since she's not—" She paused. "Well, here I am instead. I am." Clara stood up and took the older woman's hand in both of hers. She didn't say anything for a moment because there wasn't anything that covered it. "Thank you," she finally said. "Don't thank me," Margaret said briskly. "When?" She left. Clara stood at the closed door and felt the pieces shifting, rearranging themselves into a shape she hadn't seen clearly before. This wasn't just about a bank loan and a foreclosure. This was about a systematic, patient, organized effort to take land from people who wouldn't sell it willingly. And it had been going on long enough that it had become normal, long enough that people had stopped questioning it and started working around it the way you work around a dangerous patch of road, accepting its existence, because the alternative is a fight you're not sure you can win. She looked at her list, added 3 more items. Then she put on her hat and rode into town for the 2nd time in 2 days. The First Territorial Bank's local office in Caldwell Creek was a narrow building on the south end of Main Street, run by a man named Tilson, who was not Gerald Pratt. Pratt worked out of Helena, but who answered to him in every practical sense. Tilson was a small, careful man with ink-stained fingers, and the perpetually apologetic expression of someone who delivers bad news for a living and has made his peace with it. Clara walked in, sat down across from his desk without being invited, and put the freight office receipt on the desk between them. Tilson looked at it. His expression didn't change. That told her something. "I'd like to discuss the payment record on the Whitmore loan," she said pleasantly. "Specifically this transfer, and specifically why the amount and the date match a payment that your bank's records show was never made." Tilson picked up the receipt, set it down. "Miss Whitmore, the loan records are legal documents," she said. "Yes, so is this." She tapped the receipt. "A discrepancy between a bank's official record and an independent freight transfer document would be of considerable interest to the Territorial Banking Commission, wouldn't it?" Tilson's ink-stained fingers went very still. "I'm not here to make accusations," Clara said in the same pleasant voice. "I'm here to request access to the original ledger entries for the Whitmore account, all of them, specifically the entries from the period corresponding to this date. I would need authorization from Mr. Pratt to—" "Then contact Mr. Pratt," she said. "I'll wait." Tilson stood up and went to the back office. She heard him moving around back there, papers a drawer. The sound of a man deciding something. He was gone for a long time. Long enough that two other customers came in, looked at Clara sitting perfectly still in the chair, and decided to come back later. When Tilson came back, he sat down and folded his hands on the desk and said, "I'm not able to provide access to proprietary bank records without a formal legal request, Miss Whitmore. I'm sorry. If you'd like to pursue this through proper channels—" "I'll do that," she said, standing. She picked up the receipt. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Tilson." She was at the door when he said quietly, "Miss Whitmore." She turned. He was looking at his desk, not at her. "There's a lawyer in Miles City, name of Beaumont, James Beaumont. He's handled cases involving irregularities with Territorial Bank records before." He paused. "He's good." She looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you, Mr. Tilson." "I didn't say anything," he said, and went back to his papers. She walked out into the summer heat and stood on the boardwalk and felt the first real flicker of something that wasn't grief or anger or calculation, something that felt cautiously and carefully like momentum. She was 3 steps down the boardwalk when Jackson Pruitt fell into step beside her, appearing from nowhere the way men like him have a talent for doing. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I saw your horse outside the bank. I hope everything went smoothly." "It did," she said, not slowing down. "I heard about your cattle," he said, keeping pace. "Terrible thing, a fence giving way like that. Ranch work is hard enough without accidents." She stopped and turned to face him. "It wasn't an accident, Mr. Pruitt, and I think you know that." His expression didn't shift, not even a flicker. "That's a serious accusation." "It's an observation," she said. "I don't make accusations until I have proof." She held his gaze. "I'm very good at finding proof." Something moved behind his pale blue eyes. Brief, controlled. "I'm sure you are," he said. "Your father was a determined man too." He paused, and the pause had weight to it. "Determination is admirable. It can also be costly. I hope you'll remember my offer, Miss Whitmore. It's a fair one." "Goodbye, Mr. Pruitt." She walked away, and she did not look back, because looking back would have told him something, and she was done giving men like Jackson Pruitt information for free. She mounted her horse and rode east toward the coal ranch as the sun began its long summer descent toward the ridge. Ethan was waiting at the barn when she arrived, a lantern-lit papers spread on the workbench, a coffee pot on the small iron stove in the corner that he'd clearly started before she got there. He had the organized, prepared look of a man who had been thinking about this for a long time and was glad to finally be able to share the weight of it. She tied her horse and walked in and looked at what he'd laid out. There was more than she'd expected. A lot more. Copies of land transfer records. Notes in Ethan's cramped handwriting about dates and names and amounts. A letter unsigned that had apparently been delivered to the coal ranch by a rider 3 months ago, warning Ethan to stop asking questions about Pruitt's land acquisitions, which meant someone had noticed what he was doing. She looked up at him. "They warned you off." "Yes. And I kept going," he said, more carefully. She looked back at the papers. Found the pattern quickly because the pattern wasn't subtle. Once you had enough pieces in front of you, it was just large. Each property that had gone to Pruitt in the last 3 years had followed roughly the same sequence: pressure to sell refusal, followed by some form of financial distress, or damage followed within months by either a voluntary sale under duress or a bank foreclosure. 5 foreclosures all through the First Territorial Bank, all with Pratt's name on the documents. Pratt and Pruitt, she said. How long? I think at least 5 years, Ethan said. Possibly longer. Carey's involvement is harder to document, but it's there. He's been using his position on the town council to slow down anyone who tries to dispute these transfers, appointing the right people to the right committees, making sure certain complaints never get formally recorded. And the banking commission doesn't know. If they know, they haven't acted. He paused. Or someone's made sure they don't need to. She turned and looked at him directly. Ethan? Why is your land still yours? He met her eyes. Because I found out early what they were doing, and I made it clear quietly and privately that I would make a great deal of noise if anything happened to Cole land. He said it without pride, just fact. And because the Cole Ranch is bigger and better established than most of what they've targeted. Easier targets first. But eventually, he agreed. Whitmore land first, Cole land after. She understood then why he'd been so invested in her father's situation, why he'd been quietly tracking the Pruitt operation for months, checking fence lines, watching the water. He was protecting his own land, yes, but he was also watching a neighbor get destroyed by the same mechanism that would eventually come for him. We have to go to the banking commission, she said. With what we have right now, they'll look at it and tell us it's circumstantial. Then we need Beaumont. Ethan's eyebrows went up. You've already talked to someone. Someone talked to me, she said. I didn't ask for it, which means not everyone in that bank building is entirely comfortable with what's happening. He considered that. Beaumont's good, he said. But he's expensive. I know. She picked up one of the documents and looked at it. Here's what I have: a freight receipt that proves a payment was made that the bank claims wasn't made. That's fraud. If Beaumont can argue fraud, the foreclosure process stops while it's investigated. 30 days, Ethan said. Beaumont's in Miles City. I can ride there and back in 3 days if I push. You're going alone. You can't leave your ranch. Clara, you have your own land to protect, she said firmly. I have the paper, I have the name, and I have... She paused. I have enough anger to get to Miles City and back without stopping. That counts for something. He looked at her for a long moment with that look, the one she'd always hated and always found despite herself steadying. Like whatever he saw when he looked at her was something he considered worth looking at. Take Roy with you, he said finally. He's steady, and he keeps his mouth shut. All right? And take this. He picked up the unsigned warning letter and held it out to her. Beaumont should know they've already tried to suppress this. It establishes a pattern. She took it from him. Their fingers didn't quite touch, and then they did. Just for a moment, the edge of his hand against hers in the transfer of the paper. Neither of them commented on it. Neither of them moved away quickly. Ethan, she said. Yeah. She looked at the papers on the workbench. At months of quiet, careful work done by a man who'd had every reason to stay out of it and had kept going anyway. I misjudged you, she said. When I first got home, I looked at you and I thought... She stopped. You thought I might be in on it, he said. Because my land runs along yours and I hadn't told you what I knew. Yes. That's not misjudging, he said. That's being smart. She looked up at him. I'm sorry anyway. He picked up his coffee, turned toward the stove, and said without turning back around, Don't be. Just win. It was the second time she'd heard that in one day, and this time it landed differently. Not as instruction, but as something warmer and more complicated from a man who had been watching her father's land and her future, and maybe something else for a long time. She rode home in the dark with the papers folded in her coat and the lantern of the coal barn growing small behind her, and she thought about the man inside it. about the fence line between their properties that had always meant argument, about how the same line looked at differently could mean something else entirely. She pushed the thought aside. There was too much to do. Miles City first, everything else after. She set her alarm for 4 in the morning, packed her travel bag, and was asleep before the lamp had cooled. She did not dream. She needed the rest too badly for that. Roy was at the Whitmore gate before 4 in the morning, which told Clara that Ethan had already talked to him, which told her something about how the coal ranch operated and how long Ethan had been preparing for exactly this moment. She didn't comment on it. She tied her saddlebag, checked the papers in her coat pocket twice, and they rode out while the sky was still black. The road to Miles City was 40 miles of hard summer ground, and Roy was exactly what Ethan had promised, steady and quiet. He rode slightly behind her, and to the right, the way an experienced man rides when he's watching someone's back, without making a show of it. They didn't talk much in the first hour. The kind of silence between two people who have things on their minds and the sense to leave each other alone. It was Roy who spoke first somewhere around the 10-mile mark when the sky had started to go gray at the edges. "Your father was a good man, Miss Whitmore," he said, not as an opening to a longer speech, just as a fact he wanted placed on the record. "He was," she said. "He knew what Pruitt was doing," Roy said. "He told me last spring. Didn't know the full shape of it yet, but he knew enough." He paused. He was angrier than I'd ever seen him. Quieter than usual, which with Samuel meant the anger was deep. Clara kept her eyes on the road. Did he say what he planned to do? He said he was going to fight it, said he wasn't going to let them take what his father built. Roy rode a moment in silence. He also said, "And you can take this for what it's worth, miss. He said he was sorry for being too proud to ask you to come home." She didn't say anything for a while. "Thank you, Roy," she finally said. "Yes, ma'am." They made Miles City by mid-afternoon and found Beaumont's office on the second floor of a building near the courthouse. A small sign, a narrow staircase, a door that opened into a room crammed with more paper than Clara had seen outside a bank. James Beaumont himself was about 50, with a battered desk and the watchful, deliberate manner of a man who has spent decades listening very carefully to what people don't quite say. He listened to Clara for 40 minutes, without interrupting her once. She laid it out clearly in sequence: the loan, the missing payment, the freight receipt, the unsigned warning letter, the pattern of acquisitions, the connection to Pratt and Carey. She put every piece of paper on his desk in the order she'd arranged them on the ride over, and walked him through each one. When she was done, Beaumont picked up the freight receipt and looked at it for a long time. "How did you get this?" he asked. "Ethan Cole had it. He's been investigating Pruitt's land acquisitions for months." Cole. Beaumont set the receipt down. "I know that name. Good man. Careful." He picked up the warning letter next read. It set it down. Someone sent him this. Someone who apparently noticed what he was doing and wanted it stopped, but didn't go further than a letter, which suggests, Clara said, that whoever sent it didn't want to escalate, didn't want Ethan to keep going, but also wasn't willing to do what it would take to actually stop him. Beaumont looked at her for the first time since she'd started talking with something other than professional attention, something that was closer to respect. "That's a careful piece of reasoning, Miss Whitmore." "I've had 40 miles to think," she said. He almost smiled. "Here's where you stand. The freight receipt is significant if it's authentic, and it appears to be. It establishes that a payment was made that the bank's record doesn't reflect. That's not a clerical error. That's a falsified record. That's fraud." He leaned back in his chair. "The challenge is that your father signed the loan documents. Whatever irregularities exist downstream, the debt itself is legally established. To stop the foreclosure, we need to petition the territorial court for an emergency stay, arguing fraud in the maintenance of the loan record, and we need to do it fast enough that the bank can't complete the process in the time remaining." "How fast?" "I'd need 3 days to prepare the petition properly." "I have 23 days left." "That's enough time," Beaumont said. "If nothing goes wrong." She looked at him steadily. "Things have a tendency to go wrong in Caldwell Creek. Then we file in the territorial court in Helena, he said. Not the local court. Out of Carrie's reach. He picked up a pen. I'll need your authorization and a retainer. My fee for this kind of work is $40. She had $42 in her purse. She put $40 on his desk without hesitating. Beaumont picked up the money, put it in a drawer, and said, Get some rest tonight. I want to go over the details again in the morning. Every conversation you had with Pratt and Pruitt, I want the exact words as close as you can remember them. I remember them exactly, she said. He looked up. Good, he said. Come back at 7. She and Roy stayed at a boarding house on the edge of town. Clara ate her first real meal in 2 days, went to her room, sat on the edge of the bed, and allowed herself exactly 10 minutes to feel the full weight of what she was doing. The money gone, the road behind her, the ranch she'd left in the care of 2 remaining hands, and 23 days between her and losing everything her father had built. She used all 10 minutes. Then she lay down and slept. The morning meeting with Beaumont ran 2 hours, and by the end of it, she had given him everything she had, and he had given her something she hadn't expected, a name. There's a man named Corbin, Beaumont said near the end. Edmund Corbin. He worked as a records clerk at the First Territorial Bank in Helena for 6 years. He was dismissed 8 months ago officially for incompetence, but the timing coincides with an internal audit that apparently found some questions about loan documentation on several accounts. He looked at her steadily. I believe he was dismissed because he knew too much and had started keeping his own records as insurance. I believe he's been trying to find someone willing to use what he has. Clara stared at him. How do you know this? Because he contacted my office 4 months ago, Beaumont said. I wasn't able to take his case at the time. I referred him to a colleague in Helena. He paused. That colleague declined to take it 3 weeks later. Corbin has been quiet since. He's scared, Clara said. Almost certainly. Can you find him? I can try. Beaumont folded his hands. If Corbin has internal bank records showing systematic falsification of loan documents across multiple accounts, not just your father's, that changes the scope of this entirely. That's not one family's fraud case. That's a conspiracy charge against a territorial banking institution and potentially a public official. The room was very quiet. That's what they've been afraid of, Clara said slowly. That's why the warning letter. That's why the fence and the gate get me running so I don't have time to sit and think. They know this can unravel. She looked at Beaumont. They're not just trying to take the ranch. They're trying to contain the story before it gets big enough that they can't. Yes, Beaumont said simply. Which means you need to understand if this goes where it could go, the people involved will become significantly more aggressive. Not just a downed fence and scattered cattle. I understand that. Do you... He leaned forward slightly. Miss Whitmore, I want to be clear with you. I've handled cases like this before, not always successfully. The people you're describing Pratt Pruitt, a complicit local official, they have resources and they have reach. If they realize you've engaged legal counsel and are pursuing this in the territorial court, they will act. They're already acting, Clara said. They just haven't realized I'm not my father. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once. Find me a way to reach Cole from Caldwell Creek. If anything changes on the ground while I'm preparing the petition, I need to know immediately. She gave him Roy's name and the Cole Ranch address. They shook hands. She walked out into the Miles City summer with something that was not quite hope, but was the closest relative of it, the feeling of a mechanism beginning to move. She and Roy rode for home. They were 12 miles out of Caldwell Creek on the long, flat stretch before the creek crossing when Roy said quietly, Rider behind us, 2 miles back. Been there since we left the ridge. Clara didn't turn around. One that I can see. Staying back. Consistent distance. Not closing, not falling behind. She kept her pace. If he's following, he'll close when we're close to town. Less chance we'd make a scene on Main Street. That's what I figured, Roy said. They rode another mile. Then Clara said, When we hit the creek crossing, you go left toward the tree line. I'll cross straight. If he has to choose, he'll follow me. I'm the one carrying the papers. Miss Whitmore. Roy. Yes, ma'am, he said in the tone of a man who disagrees but has enough experience to know when an argument is over. At the creek crossing, she went straight across without slowing, and Roy peeled left, and she heard the distant change in the following horse's pace. Faster now, the pretense of casual travel abandoned. She kept her own horse at the same speed, didn't run, didn't panic, and watched the road ahead with the particular calm of someone who is scared and has decided that being scared is not relevant information right now. The rider came up beside her, fast pulling even before she reached the far bank. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 25, with a hard face and clothes that were trying to look like a working man's and not quite succeeding. Miss Whitmore, he said, breathless. I need you to stop. I don't believe I do, she said, maintaining her pace. Mr. Pruitt would like a word. Mr. Pruitt can write me a letter. Ma'am, this doesn't need to be. Get out of my way. She turned and looked at him full on, and whatever he saw in her face made him pull his horse back 2 feet. I'm within sight of my own county. I'm on a public road, and if you don't remove yourself from my path in the next 3 seconds, I'm going to make sure that the man I just spent 2 hours with in Miles City includes your face in his documentation. He stared at her. She kept riding. He didn't follow. Roy materialized from the tree line 40 seconds later, falling back into place beside her, and said absolutely nothing, which was one of the things she had come to appreciate most about Roy. He'll report back, she said. Yes, ma'am. Then Pruitt knows I was in Miles City. He'll guess why. Probably, Roy said. Good, she said, which surprised him enough that he glanced over. Let him know I'm not stopping. Let him show his hand. They rode into Caldwell Creek with the late afternoon sun at their backs, and the town felt different. She felt it immediately, the way the air changes before weather comes in. 2 men she didn't recognize were sitting in front of the saloon, and one of them looked at her in a way that was less observation and more inventory. A horse she didn't know was tied outside the bank. Mayor Carey was on the boardwalk outside the town hall, talking to a man in a dark suit, and when Clara rode past, Carey stopped mid-sentence. She kept her eyes forward. She went straight to the ranch, checked on the hands, ate quickly, and was at the coal barn by 7 o'clock. Ethan was there, and he was not alone. Beside him stood a thin man of about 45, with ink-stained fingers, and the eyes of someone who has been frightened for a long time, and has finally made a decision about it. This is Edmund Corbin, Ethan said. Clara stopped. He came to me yesterday, Ethan said. He'd been in Miles City trying to reach Beaumont. Beaumont's office told him Beaumont had a new client in the Whitmore case. He came here. He held her gaze. I think you need to hear what he has. Corbin looked at her with the wariness of a man who has been burned before and isn't sure he can afford to be burned again. Miss Whitmore, he said, I worked at the First Territorial Bank in Helena for 6 years. I was the records clerk for the Western Territorial Accounts, and I need you to understand what I'm about to tell you because once I say it, there's no taking it back. Say it, Clara said. He reached into the bag at his feet and pulled out a ledger. Not a copy. An original bank ledger, the spine cracked from handling the cover marked with the First Territorial Bank's official stamp. I took this when they dismissed me, he said. I knew what they were going to do, destroy the original records and replace them with corrected versions. I'd already watched them do it twice on other accounts. He set the ledger on the workbench. This is the original Whitmore account ledger. Every entry from the first loan installment to present, including the payment that was later removed from the official record. Clara looked at the ledger. Then she looked at Ethan. The payment is there, Corbin said. Your father made it. It's recorded in my hand on the date it was made. The altered ledger that Pratt presented for foreclosure proceedings removed that entry entirely. He opened to a marked page. 11 days. 1 payment. $400. It's right there. $400. Of an $1,100 debt. More than a third of the total. My father almost had it paid, Clara said very quietly. He was close, Corbin said. Close enough that when they realized how close they started the foreclosure process before he could get the rest, they falsified the record to make the debt appear larger and the payment history appear worse than it was. He closed the ledger. This isn't the only account where they did this. I have documentation on 4 others. The barn was very quiet. Outside, a horse shifted weight and the summer insects made their steady sound against the dark. "Corbin," Clara said. "Why come forward now? You've had this for 8 months." He looked at her steadily. "Because the last person I tried to give this to told Pratt I had it. 2 weeks later, my boarding house burned down. I lost everything except what I was carrying on my person." He paused. "I've been careful since. I needed someone who had enough to fight back, someone who couldn't be bought out or scared off." He glanced at Ethan briefly, then back to her. "Cole told me about you." She looked at Ethan. "I told him you tore the foreclosure notice off your own door the morning of your father's funeral," Ethan said without apology. "I told him you rode to Miles City alone with $2 left to your name, and I told him you weren't going to stop." She held his gaze for a moment. Then, she looked at Corbin. "Can you ride to Helena?" "Yes. I need you to take this ledger to Beaumont James Beaumont, attorney in Miles City. He's preparing a petition for the territorial court. With this, he's not filing for a stay on foreclosure grounds." She paused. "He's filing fraud charges against the First Territorial Bank of Helena, against Gerald Pratt specifically, and we're naming Pruitt as a co-conspirator." Corbin's face went through several things in a short time. Fear, resolution, something that might have been relief. "When?" "Tomorrow morning," she said. "Can you be ready?" "Yes." "Roy goes with you," Ethan said. "And 2 of my men." She looked at him. "Your men." "My problem too," he said simply. Clara looked at Corbin. "Don't stop in Caldwell Creek on the way out. Don't talk to anyone. Go around the town entirely, take the North Road." "Understood," Corbin said. "And Corbin." She met his eyes. "Keep that ledger on your body, not in a bag, on your body. Every mile." He nodded. He picked up the ledger and tucked it inside his coat against his chest, and she watched him do it and thought about her father, who had carried this same weight, without telling anyone until it was almost too late. After Corbin had gone to the hayloft to sleep, Clara and Ethan stood at the workbench in the quiet, and she looked at the documents still spread there and tried to find the flaw, the thing she'd missed, the piece that would unravel. "Pratt will find out we have a lawyer," she said. "If Pruitt's man saw me in Miles City, Pratt likely already knows. He'll move to accelerate the foreclosure process." "Can he do that legally?" "I don't know. Maybe not. But he can file additional documentation, raise procedural obstacles, make Beaumont spend time he doesn't have on secondary issues." She traced a finger over the land survey map that Ethan still had open on the bench. "We need to be ready for something to happen to the ranch while Corbin is on the road. If they can't stop him legally, they'll try to create a new crisis to pull me away from what I'm doing. I'll post 2 men on your fence line tonight," Ethan said, "and I'll be close." "You have your own ranch to run, Ethan." "I can run it from your fence line." She looked at him. He was looking at the map, not at her. His jaw set in that way he had when he'd made a decision and considered it settled. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Not accusatory. Genuinely. He was quiet for a moment. "Because it's right," he said. Then after a pause, "and because—" He stopped, set his jaw, started again. "Because I watched your father fight this alone for 2 years, and I couldn't make him accept help, and I am not going to watch you do the same thing." It was not what she'd expected him to say. It was more honest than the things they usually said to each other, which ran more to argument and practicality, and things left deliberately unnamed. She looked back at this map. "All right," she said. 2 men on the fence. And Ethan. "Yeah. If something happens tonight, if they move against the ranch or try to intercept Corbin, you send for me immediately. Don't make decisions without me." He turned and looked at her, and for just a moment, his expression was entirely unguarded, something warm and complicated and completely undefended. "I'm not in the habit of making decisions without you," he said. "Even when you're 40 miles away." She didn't know what to do with that, so she put her hat on and picked up her coat and said, "Good night, Ethan." "Good night, Clara." She rode home with the stars overhead and the sound of the summer insects and the feeling of something enormous turning a mechanism set in motion that could not now be stopped, that was either going to save everything or cost her the last of what she had. She was 300 yards from the ranch when she saw the light. Not lamplight, not the warm, steady glow from a window. Fire. The hay barn. She put her horse into a dead run and was screaming for the hands before she'd even cleared the gate, and by the time she got there, both men were already out with buckets, and the fire was 6 feet high along the south wall, and climbing. And there was nothing in that barn but 3 months of winter feed, and her father's old saddle, and the spare fence posts. And if she lost the feed, she had no way to run the cattle through September, which meant she'd have to sell the herd at summer prices, which meant she'd lose the one asset that could actually help her fight the foreclosure. She didn't think about any of that. She grabbed a bucket and ran. They fought it for 40 minutes. The wall was lost, the whole south side of the barn gone, but the interior was mostly intact. The feed was smoke damaged and smelled like char, but it was there. The roof held. The north wall held. When it was finally out, Clara stood with her hands on her knees in the yard and breathed. Her coat was wet. Her hands were black, and the smoke was still rolling off the ruined wall in the hot summer air. One of the hands young Denny said low and quiet, "Miss Whitmore, there's something you ought to see." He walked her around to the back of the barn, away from the burned wall to where the ground was softer. There in the dirt were boot prints, 2 sets coming from the east, stopping at the back wall, going back the same way. From the east, from the direction of the Pruitt Range. Clara crouched down and looked at the prints. Looked at the direction they'd come from. Stood up. They had made their move. Now it was her turn. She went inside, wrote a message in the clearest terms she could manage, and sent Denny on horseback to the Cole Ranch with instructions to get it to Ethan immediately. Then she washed the smoke off her hands, sat at her father's desk, and began writing a second letter. Detailed precise naming names and dates, addressed to the Territorial Commissioner of Banking in Helena. Not a petition, not a legal filing. A letter. Personal. Direct. The kind that doesn't get lost in procedure. She sealed it before dawn and addressed it in her firmest handwriting and thought about her father, who had been scared and proud and had waited too long. She was not going to wait. She was not going to be scared into silence or burned into retreat or ridden off a public road by men in working clothes with expensive boots. 11 days. 1 payment. $400. Her father had nearly done it. He'd been close enough that they'd had to cheat to stop him. That was the thing about the Whitmore land, she thought. It had never been as weak as they wanted everyone to believe. It had only been alone. It wasn't alone anymore. Ethan arrived at the Whitmore Ranch before sunrise, while the smoke from the burned barn wall was still drifting in the summer dark. He didn't knock. He came through the gate, saw the damage, walked the perimeter, once looked at the boot prints behind the barn, and came inside, where Clara was still at the desk, still writing. He set a hand on the back of her chair. Didn't say anything for a moment. Just looked at what she'd written. "The commissioner's letter," he said. "Yes. That goes out this morning. First rider I can get it to." He was quiet. Then, "They burned your feed barn the same night we met with Corbin. Someone was watching the Cole Ranch." "I know." "Which means they know about Corbin. Maybe. Or they moved against the barn because they found out I'd been to Miles City and they wanted to create damage before Beaumont could file." She set her pen down. "Either way, we don't slow down. We speed up." Ethan pulled out a chair and sat across from her. He looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from not sleeping, because you've been thinking too hard, which she recognized because she wore the same face. "Beaumont needs to know about the fire. It's additional evidence of intimidation. I'll send word with Denny when he goes back to Miles City. And Corbin. Roy left with him 2 hours ago. They're taking the north road around town." She looked at him steadily. "Ethan, if Pratt moves to accelerate the foreclosure before Beaumont files the fraud petition, how quickly can he do it?" "Legally, he'd need to give you formal notice of acceleration, which buys another 5 days minimum." He paused. "But Pratt has not always stayed strictly within the law. He's stayed close enough to it that no one's been able to catch him outside it. Until now," Clara said. "Until now," Ethan agreed. "If Corbin's ledger is what he says it is, it is." She said it without hesitation. "I looked at every entry. The handwriting is consistent. The dates track. The payment is there in black ink." She pushed back from the desk and stood up. "My father paid $400 on that loan, Ethan. He was down to $700 remaining. Pratt wiped that payment out of the record and filed for full foreclosure on a debt that was a third smaller than he claimed." Ethan was quiet for a moment with that. "Your father knew. He had to know. He kept his own ledger." She turned toward the window. "That's what he was going to fight them with, his own records. And then he died, and his records were here in this house, and they didn't know that I would come home and sit at his desk and go through every page." "They underestimated you," Ethan said. "They underestimated him first," she said. "I'm just finishing what he started." The sky was beginning to lighten. She heard one of the hands moving in the yard starting the morning work with the quiet efficiency of men who keep going regardless of what happened the night before, because the cattle don't know about fires, and the horses still need water, and the work is always there. She turned back from the window. "I need you to do something that you might not want to do." "Tell me." "I need you to go talk to Margaret Hale. She knows this town better than anyone, and she said last time I saw her that she was ashamed people had watched and said nothing." She met his eyes. "I need to know who in Caldwell Creek has been hurt by Pratt and Pruitt and is still here. Who still has their land, but lost something along the way, a partial foreclosure, a water dispute, a loan they paid that got misrecorded. Anyone who might be willing to put their name to a statement." Ethan looked at her. "You're building a case." "Beaumont is building a case. I'm finding him evidence." She picked up the sealed letter to the commissioner. "The more names on this, the harder it is to ignore. One woman fighting a foreclosure is a private dispute. 6 families alleging a coordinated fraud scheme is a scandal." He stood. "Margaret will talk to me. She's known my family as long as she knew yours." He took his hat. "Clara." She looked at him. "Last night when you were fighting the fire." He said it carefully. "Were you scared?" She considered lying. It would have been easier. "Yes," she said. "Good," he said. "That means you're thinking straight." He put his hat on. "Scared people who keep going anyway are the ones who win." He left. She stood alone in this quiet of her father's house and thought that was possibly the most useful thing anyone had said to her in a week. Then she put on her coat and went out to help with the morning work because the cattle didn't know about fires, and neither could she. By mid-morning, everything had changed. Gerald Pratt arrived in Caldwell Creek on the noon stage from Helena. Clara knew it before he'd been in town an hour. Word traveled fast in a small town, and Margaret Hale had a very efficient network of people who paid attention to things. Pratt went directly from the stage to the bank, and within 20 minutes, a rider had gone from the bank to the mayor's office, and within 40 minutes, Carey himself was at the bank. Clara got this information from Denny, who had not yet left for Miles City because the stage had been delayed, and he'd been waiting at the depot when Pratt stepped off. "Pratt looked," Denny said, catching his breath, "like a man who got bad news and came to fix it." "He knows," Clara said. "About Beaumont or about Corbin or both?" She thought fast. "Denny, go now. Don't wait for anything. Take the letter to Beaumont and tell him Pratt is in Caldwell Creek as of noon today. Tell him to file the moment he's ready. Don't wait for anything additional from me." Denny went. She found Ethan at Margaret's shop 20 minutes later. He was sitting at the back table with Margaret and 2 other women. A rancher's wife named Helen Prudhomme, whose family had sold their land to the Pruitt Cattle Company 18 months ago, and an older woman, May Sutton, who had lost a water rights dispute the year before that in retrospect lined up precisely with the pattern Corbin had described. Clara sat down, looked at the women, said simply, "I need your help." Helen Prudhomme spoke first. She was a solid, plain-spoken woman of about 40, who had the permanent look of someone who has been angry for a long time and learned to keep it useful. "You're fighting the foreclosure." "I'm fighting more than that," Clara said. "I'm fighting the system that produced it." She explained it quickly. Corbin the ledger, Beaumont, the territorial court filing. She watched their faces as she talked. Watched the recognition move across them, the particular expression of people who suspected something was wrong and are finally hearing someone say out loud what they'd only said quietly to themselves. When she finished, May Sutton said, "My loan. I paid it. Every cent on time. And then they sent me a notice saying I was 2 months behind, and when I went to dispute it, they showed me records I'd never seen before." She pressed her lips together. "I sold half my water rights to settle it. Half my water rights that my husband and I had held for 30 years. Because the alternative was losing everything." "Would you put that in writing?" Clara said. "A sworn statement dated with as much detail as you can remember, the amounts, the dates, the name of who you spoke to at the bank." May Sutton looked at her for a long moment. "What does it cost me if I do?" "I won't lie to you," Clara said. "It might cost you the goodwill of some people in this town who'd rather not see this come out. It might cost you some uncomfortable conversations." She paused. "But if this works, and I believe it will work, it might get your water rights back. And it will make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else in this county." May Sutton straightened in her chair. "Give me the paper." Helen Prudhomme said, "Me too." Margaret had already found paper. They spent an hour at that table, the 4 women writing Clara asking careful questions to draw out specific details, making sure every statement had dates and names and amounts. The kind of specificity that can't be dismissed as general complaint. By the end, she had 3 sworn statements, including one from Margaret herself, about 2 conversations she'd witnessed between Carey and Pruitt in the past year that had struck her as wrong at the time and made very clear sense now. She folded the statements into her coat. She stood. She looked at each of them. "Thank you," she said. It came out with more feeling than she'd intended. "Don't thank us," Helen said. "Just don't lose." It was the 3rd time she'd heard that in a week, and this time it landed not as pressure, but as company. She wasn't alone in this. She hadn't been for a while. She was just slow to see it. She was halfway to the door when it opened, and Jackson Pruitt walked in. He looked at her. At Margaret. At the table where the women were still sitting with their papers. His pale blue eyes moved across the room and assembled what he saw with efficient, practiced calm. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "I heard you were in town. I've been looking for you." "I'm not hard to find," she said, staying where she was. "Pratt is at the bank," Pruitt said conversationally, as if this were news she didn't have. "He's come to discuss the foreclosure timeline. Given some recent legal maneuvering, the bank has decided to accelerate the process. You'll receive formal notice this afternoon." She felt the room shift. Heard Margaret go very still behind her. The acceleration was faster than she'd expected. Pratt had moved the moment he'd arrived, which meant he'd come to Caldwell Creek specifically for this. Which meant he'd known before he got on the stage that Beaumont had been contacted. Someone had told him. She held Pruitt's gaze and kept her voice level. "Acceleration of a foreclosure, while a fraud petition is before the territorial court, is illegal, Mr. Pruitt. Mr. Pratt knows that." "There's no petition before any court," Pruitt said, "as of this morning." The ground moved again. "Your lawyer," Pruitt said carefully. "Mr. Beaumont. He has apparently decided not to proceed with the filing. I understand there were questions about the authenticity of certain documents he was presented with." He spread his hands in a gesture of polite regret. "I'm sorry, Miss Whitmore. The ranch will go to auction within 10 days. She didn't let anything show. She held it in all of it. The cold shock, the surge of panic, the instant calculation of what this meant, and she kept her face exactly where it was and said, 'Where did you hear that?' 'Small world," Pruitt said. "Legal community talks." "It does," she said. "Including about which lawyers are willing to be pressured and which ones aren't." She took one step toward him. "Beaumont has the original bank ledger, Mr. Pruitt, not a copy. The original in the hand of the bank's own records clerk, showing my father's payment in full detail. If Beaumont has withdrawn, which I don't believe the ledger still exists." Another step. "And I have 3 sworn statements in my coat right now from other families in this county with identical complaints against the First Territorial Bank. That's not a foreclosure dispute anymore. That's a pattern of organized fraud. No amount of pressure on one lawyer changes that." Pruitt's expression, finally for the first time since she'd met him, showed something real beneath the polished surface. It wasn't fear exactly, it was the calculation of a man revising his estimates. 10 days, he said, quieter now. "Then you'd better hope your friends work fast," she said. "Because I work faster." She walked past him and out the door. She was on her horse and 3 blocks from the millinery shop before she let herself feel the full impact of what he'd said. Beaumont. She needed to know if it was true. She needed to know right now. She didn't have a way to reach Beaumont directly without sending another rider to Miles City, which would take hours she might not have. She rode to the telegraph station and wrote out a message to Beaumont's office address, short and plain. "Confirm status of filing. Urgent. Whitmore." Then she went to find Ethan. She found him coming back from the east end of town, and she told him everything in about 90 seconds. Pratt's arrival, the acceleration. Pruitt's claim about Beaumont, the statements she'd collected. Ethan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Beaumont didn't withdraw." "How do you know?" "Because Roy sent word this morning from the road. They'd stopped in Powder River to rest the horses, and Roy found a telegraph station. He said Corbin was safe and moving, and Beaumont had been notified they were coming." He met her eyes. If Beaumont had withdrawn, Roy would have said. She breathed. So Pruitt was lying, or working with incomplete information. Someone told him Beaumont was a problem, and he came down here hoping to bluff you into backing off. He paused. "The question is, who told him about Beaumont?" "Someone who knew I'd been to Miles City," she said. "That rider who followed you on the road," Ethan said. "He reported back that I'd been to Miles City. Pruitt or Pratt made the assumption I'd seen a lawyer. That's not necessarily—" She stopped. "No. Someone specific told them Beaumont's name. Not just that I'd been to Miles City. His name. Which means someone knew before I came home." She thought about Tilson, the bank clerk, who had given her Beaumont's name. The man who'd looked at the far wall and said I didn't say anything. "Tilson," she said. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Or Tilson told someone he trusted who told someone else. "It doesn't matter now," she said. "What matters is the ledger gets to Helena and the filing goes through before Pratt can legally accelerate." She looked at him. "What do you know about the territorial court process? How fast can Pratt move even with the filing in place?" "He can't foreclose while the fraud petition is active," Ethan said. "That's clear law. But he can file procedural objections that slow Beaumont down, claim the ledger's provenance is in question, challenge Corbin's credibility, argue the petition lacks standing." He paused. "It buys them time, not indefinitely, but time. Then we need the commissioner's letter to arrive at the same time as Beaumont's filing," Clara said. "A private petition from a lawyer is one thing. A letter from multiple affected landowners to the Territorial Banking Commissioner with sworn statements alleging a systemic fraud pattern that opens a regulatory investigation. Pratt can't obstruct a regulatory investigation the way he can obstruct a single legal filing." Ethan looked at her for a moment. "When did you figure all this out?" "About 10 minutes ago," she said honestly. "I'm making it up as I go." Something that was fully and completely a smile crossed his face. Brief, real, nothing performed about it. "Your father used to say that," he said. "Not about legal strategy, about ranching. He said the best cattlemen don't plan, they respond." She felt the grief of that move through her quick and clean, the way it was starting to do now. Not the devastating wave of the first days, but something that passed through and left her more, not less grounded. My commissioner's letter went with Denny, she said. He's taking it to Beaumont. Beaumont can forward it with the petition or send it separately. Either way, it reaches Helena. She paused. I need to draft a second letter, a public one. Public, Ethan said. Addressed to the town of Caldwell Creek, she said. Everything, the fraud, the pattern, the names, posted in public in front of the land office and the bank and the town hall. She met his eyes. If Pratt and Pruitt want to contain this, let's make it impossible to contain. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. That's not a legal move, he said. That's a political one. Yes. It will make them angry. Good. Potentially dangerous angry, he said. Clara, the fire was a warning. If you publicly name them, then the whole town knows, she said. And it becomes much harder to make something look like an accident when half of Caldwell Creek is watching. She held his gaze. I'm done being careful about making them angry, Ethan. I'm done managing their feelings while they take everything. She paused. Are you with me or not? He looked at her for a moment that lasted long enough to mean something. I'll write half of it, he said. My property, my observations, my name at the bottom. If they come after you for this, they come after both of us. She didn't argue. She didn't tell him he didn't have to. She just said, come to the ranch. We'll write it together. They rode back side by side through the summer afternoon, and the town watched them go with the particular attention of a place that could feel something building, the kind of tension that settles into a town when its taken for granted order is about to be disturbed, and everyone knows it, but nobody says it out loud. Inside the ranch house, they sat at opposite ends of Samuel Whitmore's desk, with paper between them, and they wrote. Not a legal document, not a careful lawyerly petition. A letter in plain American English that said clearly and directly what had happened to the Whitmore family and what the pattern of evidence suggested about how and why. They wrote for 2 hours. Ethan's handwriting was different from hers. More spare, more angular. Fewer words to say the same thing which was useful. Between them, they found a tone that was neither hysterical nor cold. The tone of people who are certain about what they know and are telling you simply so you can decide what to do with it. When it was done, Clara read it through once. Ethan read it through once. She made 2 changes. He made 1. She made 3 copies by hand. Her hand was steady the whole time. Tomorrow morning, she said. All 3 go up at the same time, Land Office Bank Town Hall. Ethan nodded. Then he looked at her directly and said, What happens if Beaumont comes back and tells us Corbin's ledger isn't admissible, or that the petition won't hold? She'd been holding that possibility at arm's length all day. She let it in now, looked at it squarely. Then we have the statements from May Sutton and Helen Prudhomme and Margaret. We have the freight receipt. We have the public letters. We have enough to make this ugly enough that nobody in the territorial government can pretend they haven't heard about it. She paused. It might not stop the foreclosure, but it will follow Pratt and Pruitt and Carey for the rest of their careers. And the next family they try this on will have somewhere to point. That's not winning. Ethan said quietly. No, she said. It's not. She looked at him. But it's not nothing. They sat with that for a moment. The summer evening had cooled slightly, and the light through the windows had gone to that particular gold that comes at the end of a long July day. Then the telegraph boy appeared at the door, breathless, hat in hand, with a message from Miles City. Clara's hands were steady when she opened it. Her face was entirely still when she read it. She read it twice. Then she set it down on the desk and looked at Ethan. Beaumont filed, she said, 2 hours ago, in the territorial court in Helena. She paused. And Corbin testified, in person, to the territorial banking commissioner. She looked back at the telegram. The commissioner has opened a formal investigation into the First Territorial Bank of Helena. Effective immediately, all foreclosure proceedings tied to active accounts under review are suspended pending investigation. The word suspended sat in the room like a living thing. Ethan closed his eyes for just a second. When he opened them, something in his face had let go some held tension that she realized she'd been watching him carry for months without knowing what it was. It's not over, she said. Because it wasn't. An investigation was not a verdict. Suspended was not canceled. There was still a long road between here and the ranch being fully hers in clear daylight with no debt and no threat. No, he said. But the dam broke. She nodded. Then, without planning it, without deciding to do it, she reached across her father's desk and put her hand over his. Just for a moment. Just long enough to say what didn't need words, that they'd gotten here together and that mattered, and she knew it. He turned his hand over and held hers. Neither of them said anything. Outside, the summer evening settled over the Whitmore ranch, over the scorched wall of the hay barn, and the repaired fence line, and the pasture going gold in the dying light. And for the first time in 10 days, Clara Whitmore felt the ground under her feet as something solid. Not safe, not finished, but solid. And for now, that was everything. The 3 letters went up at sunrise. Roy handled the land office. Denny took the town hall. Clara herself walked to the bank on Main Street and pressed the 3rd copy flat against the board beside the front door with 4 nails driven clean, and she did it in full view of the early morning foot traffic on the boardwalk, and she did not hurry. She heard the murmur start before she'd finished the last nail. A woman stopped reading halfway through and turned to say something to the man beside her. 2 ranchers who'd been heading into the feed store changed direction entirely and came to read over each other's shoulders. By the time Clara had put the hammer back in her coat pocket, there were 7 people standing at the bank board and more coming. She walked back to her horse mounted up and rode to the land office to wait. It took 40 minutes for the first reaction to reach her. It was Tilson, the bank clerk, who came to find her, not Pratt, not Pruitt, not Carey. Tilson, with his ink-stained fingers and his apologetic expression, who pushed through the door of the land office where Clara stood, with Hollis going over the property survey, and said without preamble, "Mr. Pratt wants the letters taken down." Clara didn't look up from the survey map. "Mr. Pratt doesn't own those boards. He's threatening legal action for defamation. Everything in those letters is documented." She looked up then. "If he files a defamation suit, Discovery opens the bank's records to examination. Tell him that." Tilson stood there for a moment. Something in his face was working through several things at once. Then he said very quietly, "The commissioner sent a man on the morning stage. He arrived 20 minutes ago. He's at the bank now." Clara set the survey map down. "Pratt didn't call for him." "No," Tilson said. "The commissioner sent him independently." She met Tilson's eyes. "Based on the letter I sent 2 days ago." Tilson nodded, almost imperceptibly. The investigation had arrived in Caldwell Creek before Pratt had time to prepare for it. That was the crack in the wall, not the legal filing, not the public letters alone, but the combination hitting simultaneously from directions Pratt hadn't fully anticipated. She thanked Hollis, picked up her hat, and walked out. Ethan was waiting outside. He'd read her face before she'd said a word. "Commissioner's man is at the bank," she said. He straightened. "Already?" "Pratt is in there with him right now." She kept her voice low and level. "We don't go to the bank. We don't insert ourselves. We let the process work." "Can you do that?" he asked, and the question was genuine, not pointed. She looked at him. "No," she said honestly. "But I'm going to." They stayed away from the bank. It was one of the harder things she'd done all week, which was saying something. They went to Margaret's shop instead, and Margaret made coffee, and the 4 of them, Clara, Ethan, Margaret, and May Sutton, who arrived 20 minutes later, with Helen Prudhomme right behind her, sat together and waited and said less than they might have, because most of what needed saying had already been said. It was May who broke the silence about an hour in. "Pratt's going to try to put it on Tilson," she said. "When they need someone to take the fall, they'll say it was a clerk's error. Systemic negligence, not fraud. Corbin's testimony prevents that," Clara said. "Corbin was the clerk. He can speak to what was deliberate and what wasn't." She paused. "And the original ledger is in the commissioner's office in Helena by now. Original, not a copy. In Corbin's hand. You can't call that a clerk's error when the records clerk is the one who carried it out of the building because he knew it was about to be destroyed." "What happens to Corbin?" Helen asked. "Beaumont is representing him. His cooperation with the investigation is on the record." Clara thought about the thin, frightened man with the ink-stained bag who had made his decision in a hay barn and ridden north before dawn. "He'll be all right." She said it with more certainty than she had, because some things need to be said with certainty, even when the certainty isn't complete. The commissioner's man, a compact, gray-suited official named Aldridge, who had the manner of someone who had seen many things and was not surprised by any of them, came to find Clara at Margaret's shop at 11:30. He knocked. He introduced himself. He sat down at the table when Margaret offered him a chair, and he folded his hands and looked at Clara with the professional attention of a man who is deciding how much he can say. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I've reviewed the petition filed by Mr. Beaumont and the supporting documentation. I've also had a preliminary conversation with Mr. Pratt." He paused. "I'm not in a position to discuss the specifics of an active investigation, but I want you to understand that the Commissioner takes the evidence presented very seriously. The formal suspension of foreclosure proceedings on the Whitmore property is confirmed and in writing as of this morning." Clara let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. "The investigation will take time," Aldridge continued. "These things do. But I want to be clear the suspension holds for the duration. The bank cannot foreclose while the investigation is active, and based on what I've seen, the investigation will be thorough." He looked at her steadily. "You did the right thing, Miss Whitmore, coming forward quickly with documentation through proper channels. It made this possible." "My father did the right thing," she said. "He kept his records. I just found them." Aldridge nodded once, stood, shook her hand and left. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Margaret made a sound that was not quite a laugh, and not quite a cry, and was entirely human, and Helen Prudhomme pressed both hands flat on the table like she needed to feel something solid, and May Sutton said, "Lord," in a voice that carried 20 years of quiet, stubborn hope in it. Ethan looked at Clara. She looked back at him. She didn't cry. She wasn't the crying kind as a general rule, and she was too tired and too full of what came next to give way to it now. But she felt something move through her that was deeper than relief, something that had her father's name on it and her mother's, and the particular weight of land that has been held by a family for 2 generations, and almost lost, and was not lost. Was not lost. "It's not finished," she said to the room, because it wasn't. The investigation. Carrie's involvement, which had not yet been formally addressed. The question of what happened to the 5 families who had already sold under duress, whose land had already transferred. May Sutton's water rights. "No," Margaret agreed. "But the worst of it's done." "The worst of it's done," Clara said. Pratt left Caldwell Creek on the afternoon stage. Clara didn't go to watch. She heard about it from Denny, who had been at the depot for other reasons, and described the scene with the particular relish of a 20-year-old who has just watched an important man leave a town in significantly less dignity than he arrived in. Pratt had 2 bags and a hard expression, and he didn't speak to anyone. Carrie was a different matter. The mayor did not leave. He stayed in his office, and behind his careful smile and his practiced pleasantries, and for 3 days nothing happened with him. No accusation, no formal action, nothing public. Clara watched the town hall from a careful distance and thought about the difference between a man who knows he's cornered and a man who doesn't know it yet, and she decided Carrie was the first kind. He made his move on the 4th day. He came to the Whitmore ranch himself, which surprised her. She'd expected a messenger or a lawyer or something behind closed doors. Instead, it was Carrie at her gate in the late afternoon, hat in hand, looking less like a mayor and more like a man who has spent 4 days rehearsing a conversation and still isn't sure how it's going to go. She met him at the gate, didn't invite him in. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I think we should talk." "All right," she said. "Talk." He looked at her for a moment, reassessing the way he'd been reassessing her since the first day she'd ridden back into town. "The letters you posted my name is in them." "Yes." "My involvement with Pruitt was, I want you to understand, it was not what it appears." My relationship with the Pruitt Cattle Company was a professional one, supporting business development in the county, nothing improper. You used your position on the town council to prevent formal complaints from being recorded, she said. Margaret Hale's statement documents two specific instances. May Sutton's statement references a council meeting at which her water rights dispute was tabled without explanation. Both of those are in the filing with the commissioner's office. Carrie's face went through something complicated. Those are interpretations. They're testimonies, Clara said. Under oath. He was quiet for a moment. Then his voice shifted. Drop the performance got quieter and more direct, which was the most honest she'd ever heard him sound. What do you want, Miss Whitmore? She looked at him steadily. I want May Sutton's water rights restored. I want the council records from the past 3 years reviewed by an independent party. And I want your formal statement to the commissioner's investigation, full cooperation, no obstruction. She paused. If you do those things voluntarily before you're asked, that matters. It matters to the investigation, and it matters to how this ends for you. And if I don't, then the commissioner asks you officially under subpoena, and whatever you say, at that point carries considerably more weight and considerably less goodwill. She held his gaze. You're not Pratt Mayor Carey. I don't think you set out to destroy people's lives. I think you made accommodations for a powerful man because it was easier than fighting him, and I think you told yourself it wasn't really your business. She paused. But it was. And now you have a chance to do something about it. Carey stood at her gate for a long moment. He looked older than he had a week ago, or maybe she was seeing him more clearly. I'll contact the commissioner's office, he said finally. Today, she said. Today, he agreed. He left. She stood at the gate and watched him go, and thought that justice was very rarely clean. It was usually this: a man at a gate looking smaller than his office choosing cooperation because the alternative was worse. It wasn't satisfying the way she'd imagined it might be. But it was real, and it would hold, and that mattered more than satisfaction. She turned back toward the house and found Ethan sitting on the porch steps. How long have you been there? She asked. Long enough, he said. You heard? Most of it. He looked up at her. May Sutton's water rights. You made that a condition. It should have been one from the beginning, for all of them. She sat down beside him on the steps. The summer evening was coming in, cooling at the edges, the light going long and gold the way it did in July when the day finally decided to let up. Helen Prudhomme's land is going to be harder. Once a transfer is recorded and the money's changed hands. Beaumont will know, Ethan said. Let him work on it. I know. She leaned back on her hands. There's a lot left. There's always a lot left, he said. That's ranching. She laughed, a real one, brief and unexpected, the first one she'd produced in 10 days, and it surprised her with how much she'd needed it. Ethan smiled and didn't say anything, which was the right response. They sat on the steps in the evening quiet, and she thought about her father, who had sat on these same steps in every summer of her childhood and watched the light go down over the ridge with the particular contentment of a man who knew exactly where he was and chose it every day. She thought about the way he hadn't called her home, about the way he'd told Ethan instead so she could keep her 14 months of figuring out who she was away from this place, and come back if she came back as herself and not as a rescue. She had come back as herself. She had figured some things out, though not the ones she'd gone to Miles City expecting to figure out. She'd figured out that she was her father's daughter in every way that mattered, including the stubborn ones. She'd figured out that the land was not a weight she'd been escaping, it was something she'd been growing into. And she'd figured out, somewhere between a burned barn wall and a commissioner's telegram, and a man who checked fence lines because it was practical and not sentimental, that she had not been as alone as she'd believed. Ethan, she said. Yeah. The fence line, she said, between our properties, the one we've been arguing about since we were 12. He looked at her sideways. What about it? I think we've been arguing about the wrong thing, she said, for a long time. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what's the right thing? She looked at him. He looked back at her. The evening light was doing something particular to the world the way it does when a long, hard stretch is finally ending, and everything looks both more fragile and more real than it did before. "I'm not going back to Miles City," she said. "I want you to know that. This is where I'm staying." "I know," he said. "I knew that when you tore the notice off the door. And I'm going to need help," she said. "With the ranch, with the investigation, with the parts that come next, and there are a lot of them." She paused. "I'm not asking for charity." "I know you're not," he said. "I'm asking for—" She stopped. Let herself say it plainly, because she was done with things left unnamed. "I'm asking for a partner, in the practical sense, and possibly in other senses if you're willing to have that conversation." Ethan Cole looked at her for a long moment, with a face that was doing something she hadn't seen it do before. Something open and certain and completely without armor. "Clara," he said, "I have been willing to have that conversation for approximately 8 years. She felt something ease in her chest that she hadn't known was tight. "You could have said something. So could you." "We're both idiots," she said. "Spectacular idiots," he agreed. "Considering the circumstances." She laughed again. He did too. And it was the kind of laughter that comes after hard things, and means more for that, the kind that doesn't erase what was difficult, but sits beside it and makes it possible to carry. 3 weeks later, Gerald Pratt was formally charged with fraud by the Territorial Banking Commission. The charges covered 6 accounts, 4 counties, and 5 years of falsified records. Edmund Corbin's testimony was cited as central to the case. Beaumont sent Clara a copy of the filing with a brief note in his spare angular handwriting. "Your father would have been pleased." She read it twice, set it on the desk beside the freight receipt and the original bank ledger entry which Beaumont had returned to her after the commission had made their official copies. She ran her finger across the entry in Corbin's careful hand, the payment, the date, the amount. $400. Her father's $400 paid and recorded and nearly stolen, and now restored to the record where it belonged. Aldous Carey gave his full cooperation to the investigation, as he'd promised at her gate. His statement implicated Pruitt in 3 specific conversations that constituted conspiracy to commit fraud. It wasn't everything, but it was enough combined with everything else to ensure that Jackson Pruitt's land acquisitions came under formal review. 2 of the 5 transferred properties were found to have occurred under fraudulent duress. The legal process to restore those properties to their original owners was slow, as legal processes always are, but it had begun. May Sutton's water rights were restored by county order 6 weeks after the investigation opened on the basis that the original dispute resolution had been procedurally improper. May came to the ranch to tell Clara in person, and she brought a pie, and she sat at Samuel Whitmore's kitchen table and said with a directness that Clara recognized as the particular style of a woman who has been through enough to stop dressing things up, "Your daddy would have loved to see this." "He would have been insufferably proud," Clara said. "Yes," May agreed. "That too." Roy stayed on at the Whitmore Ranch, which had always been his intention and had never really been in question. Denny stayed too. Clara hired a third hand in August, a quiet young man from the North Range, who had heard about the fight from someone who heard it from someone else, and said he wanted to work for a ranch that didn't back down. She put him to work repairing the south barn wall, which she had decided to rebuild herself, rather than cover over, because a thing that happened ought to leave a mark you can look at rather than a smooth surface that pretends it didn't. The fence line between the Whitmore and Cole properties got rebuilt that autumn. It was straighter than it had ever been, better posted, better wired, with a gate at the midpoint that had not been there before, a practical adjustment. Ethan said for moving cattle between the 2 properties during the seasonal rotations that they'd begun running as a shared operation. Clara said it was the most practical gate she'd ever seen. Ethan said he was a practical man. She said she'd noticed. The gate stayed open more often than it was closed, which said most of what needed saying about the fence line they'd argued over for 20 years. On a Thursday evening in late August, when the summer was finally beginning to let go, and the nights were cooling, and the grass on the north pasture had come back stronger than anyone had expected. Clara sat at her father's desk and wrote a letter. Not to a lawyer or a commissioner or a bank. To no one in particular, or to everyone, which is the same thing. She wrote about a man named Samuel Whitmore who had built something from nothing on Montana ground and held on to it longer than anyone had a right to expect, and who had been too proud to ask for help and wise enough to make sure in his own oblique way that help was positioned nearby when it was needed. She wrote about what it means to come home and find that home is not what you left, but something larger, something that has been waiting for you to grow into it. She wrote about the summer of 1878, which had been the hardest summer of her life, and the one in which she had finally fully become herself. She didn't send the letter. She folded it and put it in the desk drawer beside her father's watch where it would keep. Some things are written to be kept, not sent. Written so that the person who wrote them knows clearly and permanently that they understood what happened to them and chose to face it and did not let it pass without meaning. The Whitmore land stood. It had always stood. It would keep standing through seasons and disputes and the slow, ordinary work of building something that outlasts the people who build it. That was what her father had known in the end when he'd been too proud to call her home, but had made sure the people she needed were close by. He'd known the land would survive him. He'd known she would come back. And he'd known the way stubborn, loving people know things they refuse to say directly, that she wouldn't face it alone. He'd been right about all of it. He usually was. That was the thing about Samuel Whitmore, the most infuriating, most private, most steadfast man who had ever lived, who had loved his daughter so completely that he'd protected her freedom even from himself. She carried him in every decision she made from that summer forward. In the straight back and the set jaw and the willingness to tear a notice off a door and mean it. In the knowledge earned and paid for and absolutely certain that the land was hers, the fight had been worth it and she was exactly where she was supposed to be.